Hello, my name is CJ Lovik, and in the video we are going to disclose for the first time both the failures and the triumphs of attempting to unseal the mystery of the Lord's 7,000-year sabbatical prophetic calendar for mankind, and then I will reveal the final results of almost a decade's work in my corrected and final version of the 7,000-year sabbatical calendar that reveals dates that we have been told are unknowable. My journey began in 2016 when I launched on a serious investigation into the pictures and number language that is the foundation of the phonetic Hebrew language. As I was reading the amazing prophetic book of Isaiah, I came to the 46th chapter, where I read the following verse, which caught my attention. "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." Now I want you to notice the word declaring, not hiding, not forbidding, but rather inviting us to marvel at the Lord's unique and unduplicatable attribute to declare things from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done. Can you get more ancient than the supernatural word spoken by God letter by letter to Moses regarding the first 6 days of creation followed by the seventh day of rest? Can you find a beginning in this world that predates the first revelation written in the Torah? The evidence of what happened next has been archived and saved and can be found on YouTube under the title The Bereshit Passover Prophecy. This video was first published about 5 years ago on YouTube. This is a summary of the basic dispensational timeline that is hidden in plain sight in the last 3 Hebrew pictographs and numbers found in the 6-letter Hebrew word Bereshit, which is translated as "in the beginning" in your English Bible. When I first saw and discovered this cryptic dispensational 7,000-year timeline, I knew that I was going to begin a new chapter in my life, as I was going to dedicate the remainder of my life to the investigation of God's timeline for mankind. The chart you're looking at is an exact replica of the first timeline I produced for myself after viewing the Hebrew word Bereshit. I couldn't have known at the time I produced and published this chart how close I had come to the correct sabbatical calendar. Close, but full of errors. There are errors in this chart that have taken me the better part of 8 years to figure out. The creation date, for instance, is not 4004 BC. The sin date is not 3970 BC. The 70th week of Daniel is not going to begin in 2023, and there are not 7,000 years between 3970 BC and 3030 AD. But other than that, what is there not to love about this first attempt at solving one of the most elusive prophetic masterpieces in the world? God's calendar blueprint for mankind, never mind the Holy Grail or finding the lost Ark of the Covenant. This is humongous, if it's possible. And of course, if it was possible, somebody a lot smarter than me would have found it, right? Well, God used an Arab lad who had a passion for throwing rocks in order to bring to light the amazing Dead Sea Scrolls. Perhaps God can use me as his unqualified child servant to reveal his 7,000-year calendar. I have spent thousands of hours of study on this topic, and the results have been, well, let's just say uninspiring. Now, I did learn a thing or two, but mostly what I learned was that there are at least 3 authoritative opinions regarding almost everything, including important Hebrew dates that I believe we could use to connect the sabbatical cycles that began with creation. But since I was neither sure of the creation date or even absolutely sure of the crucifixion date, I grabbed onto the one thing I thought at the time would lead me out of the muddle, but instead it made the muddle worse. The light at the end of the tunnel came when a couple of very prominent Jewish Messianic rabbis, who I have the greatest respect for, revealed the Roman dating on the Shemitah and sabbatical 7-year cycles. So without doing my own research, I relied on these sabbatical dates based on the so-called Torah calendar, and without going into all the details, I produced and published that the 70th week of Daniel was going to begin before the Feast of Trumpets in 2022. The light at the end of the tunnel turned out to be a freight train full of error that ran over me. You know, it is true that you don't learn much from success, but the rod of correction that comes with failure, well, it sure gets your attention. So the first thing I did was bake a generous portion of humble pie, which I publicly ate. In other words, I admitted my error, and I admitted it was mine alone, and I owned it. With one epic failure on my record, the last thing I want to do is repeat that experience. I took about 6 months off in order to think about it. How was I going to go forward? Giving up was not an option for me, as I truly do believe that I was called to this task, and I believe the failure was sent my way not to defeat me, but to teach me, and so it did. During the time of reflection and study, I came to the conclusion that there was one thing I needed to know for sure, and 3 things I needed nailed down to be absolutely bulletproof before I had any chance of accomplishing my goal of unsealing the mystery of the 7,000-year calendar. One of the mistakes I made was thinking that the 7,000-year calendar started with the sin event. I don't know what I was thinking. Now, the sin event took place in 3971, not 3970. So obviously, the 7,000-year calendar is composed of 1,000 weeks of years. To be clear, the 7,000 years must be composed of, start with, and end with a sabbatical cycle. In order to figure that out, I needed to identify at least one sabbatical cycle that was rock solid. Once I had one true sabbatical start date, I could go back in time and discover the start date for the sabbatical cycle that was the closest to the 3971 sin date. This started a completely new line of inquiry for me as I went through all my research and identified over 200 Bible headlines that I believed would be connected with the sabbatical cycle. When I finished, I put all 200 on a spreadsheet, and I created a program that checked each one of the 200 years that I had put up on the spreadsheet. And I could use any year I wanted to check them. Well, you only need to check your dates against 7 possible years in a row, as the 7-year cycle demands. So I decided to use the possible creation dates starting with the year 4000 BC. Now, to be clear, this does not prove the creation date, but it did help me find and identify the sabbatical cycle that began the year after the 3971 sin event. Another clue that I was dealing with a calendar that revealed the underlying heavenly logic with each new discovery. Well, I checked all 200 dates connected with biblical events based on the best scholarship I could find. I checked all 200 against the year 4000 BC, and of the 200, I got 10 positive matches that had exactly 7 years between year 4000 and the dates I was checking. So I repeated the test for the year 4001, 4002, 4003, and 4004. And the results were all about the same, as each of these years got about somewhere between 9 and 11 matches that were all in sync with the 7-year cycle. Finally, I tested all 200 dates against the year 4005 BC, and I hit pay dirt. Over 160 positive matches, almost 170 matches that were exactly a 7-year duration of time between 4005 BC and the most important dates in the Bible, all divisible by exactly 7 years. I had discovered and could now choose from over 160 dates that were consistent with the 7-year cycle start dates. Well, I only needed one sabbatical start date in order to discover the sabbatical cycle that was closest to the 3971 BC sin date. The sabbatical cycle that would begin the 7,000-year countdown. So I checked my list and found 4 sabbatical years connected with biblical headlines that no one was disputing, and this is important. No one is disputing these dates. So I picked the 4 most prominent biblical headlines that were indisputable, starting with the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. Then I picked the siege of Jerusalem in 589 BC, and then the siege that happened in 70 AD, and I added to the list the 1967 AD restoration of Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. Now, I know I could have just gone forward one sabbatical cycle at a time, starting from the year 4005 BC until I found the first sabbatical cycle that occurred after the sin event that took place exactly 4,000 years from the year of the cross event in 30 AD. But I figured, what fun would that be? And since I'd spent countless hours of research identifying just over 200 historical years connected with Bible headlines, I could not resist the dramatic drumroll and the wow moment that would follow when all four of these sabbatical dates all pointed to the year 3970 BC as the year of the first sabbatical cycle that began 1 year after the sin event that took place in 3971 BC. I later discovered that the 3970, that sabbatical cycle, was the sixth sabbatical cycle from the creation date, which is another clue that there's an unseen hand monitoring the 7,000-year calendar in order that his counsel would stand and that he will do all his pleasure. With just one authoritative sabbatical date, the date 3970 BC, we can now investigate the following major milestones of the 7,000-year calendar. Going forward 7,000 years from the 3970 BC start date, you land on 3031 AD. Check this for yourself with the date duration calendar. Well, knowing the end date of the millennium is 3031, you can then go back in time exactly 1,000 years and identify the millennium that began in 2031, the reign of Christ, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth. Knowing the start date of the millennium, which would be 2031, allows you to go back another 7 years in time to identify the start date of the 70th week of Daniel in the fall season of 2024 AD. In summary, if we go forward from the start date of the first sabbatical cycle that begins the year after sin entered the world, and we add 1,000 7-year periods, we land on 3031 AD, 7,000 years later. And 7,000 is surely divisible by 7, 1,000 times. But now we have a mystery. So if you check the years 2024 and 2031 against a sabbatical year, you're going to discover that they're not divisible by 7. To be clear, starting with the sabbatical year 3970 BC, going forward 857 sabbatical cycles lands you on the sabbatical year of 2030 AD. Well, the problem is that the duration of time between 3970 BC and 2030 is only 5,999 years, not the required 6,000 years. Do we have a problem? The answer is no. Instead, we have an opportunity to see firsthand how the Lord can reconcile this math dilemma without missing a beat in the 7-year repeating cycle. So the answer is that the 70th week of Daniel takes place between the Jubilee years that end in 2024 AD and the other Jubilee year that ends in 2031 AD. In other words, we're looking at a 7-year, 2,520-day cycle that begins and ends at the end of 2 Jubilee cycles that are contained inside a sabbatical cycle. If you have any questions about this, please go back to Rock Island Book Channel and view update number 9, titled The Miracle of the Double Jubilees. Remember, we're not exploring a 6,999-year calendar. We're exploring a 7,000-year calendar that is precise to the second. While you're thinking about that, let me show you how I discovered the creation date of 4005. Going back in time from the Jubilee date of 1408 BC, when Israel entered the Promised Land, we discover the first Jubilee date that precedes the sin of Adam in 4005 BC. 4005 BC minus 1408 BC equals 2,597 years. Divided by 49 equals 53 Jubilee cycles. What about Noah's flood? Noah's flood is always dated based on the number of years that took place after creation, based on the chronology revealed in Genesis chapter 5. The reason for this is simple. If you don't know the creation date, you can only date the flood based on Anno Mundi, the years after creation. The flood took place 1652 a.m. after creation, Anno Mundi. we can now give the start date of the flood, a date on the Roman calendar. The date is 2353 BC. 4005 minus 1652 years equals 2353. 4005 minus 253 equals 1652. 1652 divided by 7 equals 236 sabbatical cycles. So what about the decree from Artaxerxes that began the 70 weeks prophesied in Daniel that ended with the crucifixion of the Messiah after the 69th week of years? That's 483 years. Well, using the start date from the sabbatical cycle, 3970 BC, or for that matter, any other sabbatical date, we can now settle the disputed date of the decree that ranges from between 457 BC and 455 BC. 4005 BC minus 456 BC equals 3,549 years divided by 7 equals exactly 507 sabbatical cycles. The decree went forth as many, if not most, of the scholars thought it did. The answer is 456 BC. What about the completion of the 120 non-consecutive 50-year Jubilee cycles? Everybody's talking about that. Well, let's see how that works. 3970 BC to 2031 AD equals exactly 6,000 years. Divided by 50 equals 120 50-year Jubilee cycles. 3970 BC to the sabbatical year of 2030 AD only equals 5,999 years, a year short of the 120 50-year Jubilee cycles. Now, to answer the question everybody's asking me, what about the rapture? Isn't it going to happen in 2023? The answer I have is simple. I have no idea when the rapture is going to take place, but I do believe it will take place before the year of Jubilee that ends on the Day of Atonement on Tishri 10 that's going to take place in 2024. Could the rapture take place in 2023? It sure could. I have been contacted by many who are experts at reading the historical signs of the times, and they are making a good case for the 2023 rapture. I believe they might be right, and I certainly would not be disappointed. Other watchmen have spent their time studying the signs in the heavens, and they are excited about the possibility that this is the year of the rapture. So what makes what I am presenting special or different from almost all the other areas of investigation that are converging at a quickening pace? Well, the information I'm disclosing is ancient. The 70 AD destruction of the temple, that is the start date for the amazing 49-year Jubilee cycle that ends after the 40th Jubilee, will be fulfilled after 1,960 years that fall on 2030. The year that begins the final Jubilee that caps off exactly 6,000 years in the Jubilee year that comes to its conclusion in the fall of the year 2031 AD and ushers in the 1,000-year millennial reign of the Messiah. Then consider the Ezekiel 4 prophecy that reveals the 701 BC sign to the house of Israel that was prophesied over 2,700 years ago. Not to mention the most important sign, the sign of the cross that took place in 30 AD and signals that the second coming will happen after 2 days, or 2,000 years. That prophecy can be found in the prophetic book of Hosea and will be fulfilled in the year 2031 AD, fulfilling both the 6,000 years of man's time to govern himself on the earth and the 120 50-year Jubilee cycles that will all come to its conclusion 1 year after the 2,000 years from the cross, just as it was prophesied. So what makes this astounding and something that should rock you out of your complacency is that everything I have, everything I'm presenting in this, I believe, my most important update, has nothing to do with current events. It has nothing to do with visions and dreams that the Lord is sending to His children in these last days. Nothing based on the headlines of the day, nothing to do with flying saucers, nothing to do with the signs the Lord is displaying in the heavens. And yet, here we are with the heavens declaring His soon coming, the current earth-shaking events on the earth heralding the beast system prophesied in Daniel and the book of Revelation, and much, much, much more. And on top of all of this, the 7,000-year calendar is now being published in order to comfort those who are anxiously waiting for the blessed hope, and warning those who mock God and hate His Son. Yes, I will continue to publish updates until the Lord comes or I go. But please understand that this update is the last and final word from me on the timing of the 70th week of Daniel, which is appointed on the Lord's calendar to begin on Tishri 10 on the Day of Atonement in 2023 and end on Tishri 10 on the Day of Atonement in the fall of 2024. 2,520 days later, on the Day of Atonement in the year 2030, that ends in 2031 and completes the most horrible time ever experienced on the earth. And on that appointed time of Tishri 10, 2031, I believe the Lord will return to earth and complete all that is necessary to usher in His 1,000-year reign from Jerusalem on a newly refurbished earth. So I want to thank all the faithful subscribers who have encouraged me with their kind and helpful comments for all these years. And I hope this update is a blessing and an encouragement to you as you await the Lord's soon coming to meet us in the clouds and escort us to the place in the Father's house that He's prepared for us. Update number 11 is coming up soon. Stay tuned, and Maranatha.